Hello everyone, thanks for being here. I wanted to start with some questions, kind of strange questions. We'll come back to them, but as I was listening to some of the talks and things, I started to wonder, like, what if in modeling branchial space or radial space or all of these different kind of models that we've thought about, if we're actually somehow modeling cognition already? In the deep optimization, how many people were in the Watson? We talked a lot there about a new way of approaching cognition. And actually, I see this kind of common thread between the talks from Michael Levin and the ones from Watson, and even the one on emotion, a lot of the things we were talking about, interdisciplinarity, the ones earlier today, Esteban. Something is going on. Maybe there's some kind of new way, new approach. I don't know, do you guys know about the Macy conferences? I'm sure you do, from like the 30s and the 40s. It was basically an interdisciplinary collection of some really interesting minds from really different places, and a lot of big things came out of that, like cybernetics, for example, and all the stuff that kind of came from there. So somehow I feel like maybe something like that's going on. There's a lot of different disciplines here. There seems like maybe there's a new way of looking at some of these big issues. The one I look at is cognition, so that's what I'm coming at. So I have this idea of way-making, a philosophy of cognition. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if you take a sensory body or an agent, and it's in an encounter, right? We could talk philosophically about that for hours. But I basically mean the way that it makes its way through that encounter is its cognition. It's at that very simple level. So I really mean biological development at just about every scale. This is like walking, swimming, crawling, but also thinking, coding, all this kind of stuff. Mind, what we think of as mind and thought, I'm seeing this as continuous, and I'm calling it way-making. I think Michael Levin calls it navigation, and I'll say why I don't use navigation. It has just to do with specific uses of that term in neuroscience, but pretty much we're saying the same thing. I was surprised about that. I hadn't seen those papers before. So that's kind of what I mean, is there's been a lot of surprises like that for me. And of course, it's also just me making connections to what I'm interested in. But I also feel like there is some bigger thing. And a lot of it has to do with attention and awareness and our change in that. And like, why is meditation becoming so important now? And there is a shift, there's always a shift going on. But this is really specific to cognition and the role that cognition plays in our lives individually, but also how we think about the world. So there's a lot of big debates in the philosophy of mind. I don't want to get into all of those, but of course I think about them all. And of course this idea of cognition has to address them. You've probably heard of a lot of them. And when we get into connectionism, functionalism, computationalism, we really have to start debating a lot of things about the body and the role of the brain and how we understand representations and all these big things. But I feel like we're kind of stuck in dichotomies, like we're kind of stuck in the so-called mind-body problem, which you've probably heard of, or this either-or mentality of it's either top-down or bottom-up. We've talked about that a lot in a lot of different contexts. Or it's either the brain or the mind or the body. There's a kind of weird dichotomy that we don't really seem to believe in anymore, but that still structures the way we think about cognition. And I think we confuse we talk about consciousness and mind and cognition, and all these are incredibly important, of course, but I feel like these terms are very confused. Like we either use them all as one way or we use them in really different ways across disciplines. So I'm trying to sort of address this, and how I want to address it is to find a way of thinking about cognition that works across scales and species and disciplines. So as a philosopher, I have to deal with all that stuff, and I am writing papers to address it, and I encourage you to write to me or in the Discord if you have any like weird philosophical questions about mind-body problems or functionalism, and like please ask me, because it's very helpful if I have to try to solve that. It's a really good, excellent way for me to think through all of this, because I do have to solve all that, but I don't want to talk about it today, because that would be hours and hours. And also I think we have bigger concerns, which actually we've talked about here a lot too. There's a lot here, right? Like whether you want to look at the political divide or you want to look at just like environmental concerns, we have some big issues right now. And to try to imagine that cognition doesn't have anything to do with that doesn't make sense anymore. How we think about thought, mind, the human position compared to other species when it comes to cognition or intelligence, which I think are different things, matters a lot right now. And I just want to keep this kind of about that bigger frame. So I think it would be helpful, as I said, to have an idea of cognition that we can really use across disciplines and species and scales, that we could actually just kind of understand as it pertains to Michael Levin's work in biology or in robotics, and it pertains to pretty much however we want to talk about cognition and at whatever level. If you want to talk about a cell, or you want to talk about a human body, or you want to talk about a social group. Is that possible? I don't know, but I think it is. And I do think there's this common framework emerging, which of course is kind of also how I'm seeing this conference in a way, but I don't think I'm just imagining that. Actually, there's a lot of new things here that are not easy to digest, and I think that's a sign that we are rethinking what cognition is and what ecology is and what all of this really means together. Of course, I studied this at Max Planck Institute and Berlin School of Mind and Brain and other places relative to the hippocampus, which we heard a little bit about in the last talk. And I'll get into that in just a second, but I also think there's a lot of other models, and I'm also sort of putting these into the framework. Michael Levin, for example, is kind of new, but a lot of this Margulis and other ways of thinking about biology feeds into that. There's also a lot in spatiotemporal neuroscience. I was also part of the Northoff lab, and this is a different way of thinking about it, a lot of nestedness, and there's many ways. I won't get into all of them, but I'm basically, what I'm doing is looking at all this and thinking of it as a framework I'm calling waymaking. So it's not like I've just come up with some completely new thing. I am calling it, it's a new philosophy, but I'm really trying to ground it in actual recent research in different fields of science to show that we can actually have this scaled idea of cognition across species. And a lot of that has to do with technology and computation. I think that's an incredibly important part of it, too. I don't think that's like somewhere on the edge. So that's my favorite little creature, the seahorse, which means hippocampus in Greek. And I won't go into all this now, but in a really generalized way, the hippocampus, as you know, is essential for memory and knowledge acquisition. I think you probably heard of this guy, H.M., from in the 50s. They removed the hippocampus. It's more complex than that, but they removed the hippocampus, and he couldn't make new memories, right? So from the 50s on, it was like, oh, the hippocampus is all memory. And then in the 70s, maybe you've heard of these like place cells that were discovered by John O'Keefe. And then we had, the hippocampus is the GPS of the brain. So over like the next 20, 30 years, it really took a long time for it to actually become, it won the Nobel Prize in 2008 or something. But so slowly it became, the hippocampus is about how we move in the world. It's about navigation. We have a GPS. So here you can just, in a really wide brush strokes, I'm saying, okay, that's already thinking and moving through the world. And it's the same area of the brain. So what if we thought of biological development as cognitive from the beginning and at any scale? Is there something wrong with that? And when I say cognitive, I don't mean mind and thought. I don't mean cells are having little thoughts and talking with language and things like this. I mean, this is completely like a different scale of that cognition. But it's continuous with it. If you think of it as how any being, body, I call it agent-based sometimes just because it helps to try to think of it as just from where you're measuring, because we can also measure from different agent bases, not only our own. That's kind of what science does, right? So from any agent base, how that agent is encountering, how it's making sense of that encounter, making its way, is for me cognition. And so that's walking, that's crawling, that's swimming, that's also thinking, that's also memory, that's also creating computer programs, and so on and so forth. Those are different scales and completely different landscapes. But they're, for me, continuous. We can see how thought and all this kind of qualia and all this, what seems very mysterious, is actually making way. It's how we are making way, often through our own patterns. We heard about habits in one of the lectures, I think, in a few of them. And a lot of thought is actually us observing or becoming aware of our own patterns of movement, how we've made way in the past, our trajectory. So there would be a lot to say about that, but it's just, I wanted to give you a little taste. So just again, it's how an agent is making its way through its encounter. It's going to always be multidimensional, happening in many different directions at once, and it's a kind of measurement. So these are just some key ideas. Nestedness scaling, agent-based assessment, it's continuous, and it really changes what space, time, and landscape is going to mean. So, for example, we've talked a lot about all these different spaces, conceptual space or transcriptional space, or it's very popular now to have these different spaces because it helps us understand the framework. Oh, we're talking about genetics now. or oh, we're talking about biology, or we're talking about language. So I think once you understand waymaking as how you're moving through the encounter, you understand we have many different ongoing encounters at once. We're not just in physical space or mental space or transcriptional space. These are all continuous one space, but depending from what position we're measuring them, they're going to align differently, right? So these are some key terms: affordances, trajectories, landscape spaces, and nestedness. And of course I won't go into all of them, but I think we've heard about a lot of these. And I just want to look at it really briefly. So this trajectory, if you think of the day you were born until now, you've sort of had a trajectory through time and space. And that isn't only like your physical body growing and moving. It's also everything you've learned, every conversation you've had, every book you've read. That's all part of your trajectory, right? Your cognition. And that cognition doesn't like stop and start with how you've learned how to move through the world, like walking or crawling or being in a wheelchair or whatever. That's part of it, but it's also the books you've read, what your family has said to you, conversations you've had with people, music you listen to. None of that is discontinuous. And every life will have a unique trajectory. A lot of us here probably have a lot of similar regularities, and we also have really different ones. You know, like the way we've moved through the world emotionally, mentally, what has been said to us, what we've read. There's probably a lot of overlap because we're here, but there's also really a lot of different trajectories there. And of course, to have a trajectory, you have to have a landscape. So that's just the space that's holding whatever this way is you're making. Basically, I'm just trying to open up this idea of what a landscape is or a space. And I think we heard a lot about this in Levin and other places. And there was spatial spatiality. I don't know if any of you came to that, or I guess a lot of you were a part of that. But there was also talk from Peter Gardenforce, I think, about concept spaces. And he actually did a paper with the lab I worked with about how thinking and navigating might be the same thing. So there's all these kind of overlaps. But there he talks about concept space. So yeah, we have to think of all these different ways of having a landscape: conceptual, virtual, mathematical, emotional. Landscapes are nested, multi-layered, and they include these other conceptual or emotional spaces. I was talking about memory in the hippocampus. It's another nice way to think about how when you walk through a city, for example, maybe this city or maybe New York City or maybe your hometown where you were born, you're going to have a really different mental, emotional space trajectory than whoever might be walking right beside you. Even though you're walking in the same space and you're sharing a lot of regularities in some of those spaces, your memories are going to be different, your mental space is going to be different. And that's an important way making too. And all of those are going on at once. So it's really a lot about regularities and how they scale. And from what position we're measuring them, how we're going to look at these different regularities. So depending on what we want to measure, if we're trying to think about emotions or how to design a city or something, we're going to look at different things, but all of them actually end up being really important the more that we can handle these different scales. I was connecting this to some of the other speakers I saw. For example, I already talked about Peter Gardenforce, this We Think and the Way We Navigate paper. And then I saw that Barbara Chervesky was here, and she also says, I think it's Mind is Motion or something, is that, yeah? And so she's also touching on a lot of these things. There's many different ways I think people are trying to get a grip on this, or are getting a grip on this, and doing science around this. And this was a quote from her: "All living things, even plants, must move and act in space to survive. All thought begins as spatial thought." That's really interesting, right? To think of plants too as cognitive. It's not our cognition, but it's cognitive. It's cognitive. They're making way. They have to make way. And then Michael Levin, we went through some of his papers online, just thinking about that too. And there's a lot. It's really rich. There's a lot there. And he has this idea of living organisms solving this problem solving in different spaces as being an invariant for thinking about the scaling of cognition. So what would it mean if we really thought, okay, everything is cognitive that's developing biologically? It's just really different kinds of cognition. Why does it matter? You know, does it matter? Yeah, I think it does matter. Well, for one, to try to get past this dichotomous thinking, which I think is very helpful. I'm not saying we should reject it, actually, because it's very helpful to see things in contrast and as opposites. It's a really helpful heuristic, but we don't see it as a heuristic. We see it as you're either on this side or you're not on this side. There's not a lot of flexibility about which way is which. Even in science, sometimes you have to sort of choose if you're going to be top down or bottom up, and then you study that. When maybe it's not top down and bottom up, maybe it's not cognitive stacking from top to bottom, but it's multidimensional. And like, how can we open that space so that it's not just one direction, it's not up and down, and it's not either or? I do think if we could understand cognition and development across disciplines, then this would actually be beneficial for a lot of the bigger problems that we face that we're actually trying to address with our technologies and our science. We could actually change how we do experiments, because stimulus response is also based on these models. But also just, could we rethink our position as humans, but also the importance of our science in our interdisciplinarity, how what we're doing is going to connect to other disciplines. It's a different way of thinking if you understand it all as scaled. If you think of it in terms of complexity science and things like this, where when you're changing one part, you're changing the other parts, and there can be more than one self, and you can also have more than one agent base. You can judge from more than one position. And in a way, when we develop microscopes, telescopes, all these technologies, our computers, we're sort of trying to do that. We're trying to discover how other positions make way. And in so doing, maybe it's actually we're discovering something about ourselves, or maybe we're a part of life, with life discovering more of itself. These are different ways of thinking about it. I think Watson today got into that in the end of his talk about opening this up, this ecological idea. And yeah.
Have you heard of, it's a bit of a controversial figure as far as I know, but have you heard of Bernardo Kastrup?
Yeah, I have.
Okay, because the life discovering itself kind of reminded me of that. Like, his analytical idealism kind of argues for a similar view. Anyway, a controversial figure. Let me just leave it there.
Okay, I'll look at it again. I remember him in debates about panpsychism and stuff.
Well, they think that, yeah, it's a bit like, but then again, integrated information theory was also sort of flirting with the idea. I mean, what am I to say?
In which sense?
Huh?
In which sense integrated information?
Well, there's.
Like Koch is panpsychist, so maybe.
Well, not like panpsychist, but like sort of flirting with the idea, the possibility of like measuring, it's like.
Yeah, I was just
I
curious
think a
about
lot of the argument over panpsychism is actually what I was saying before, confusion about this way we use the term consciousness.
Maybe,
and
yeah.
Because a lot of times they're saying the same things, these two sides.
But that's what
it's
we
just
do
like,
always. Like,
we're saying cells are thinking about themselves. No.
But that's like a fundamental human thing almost. It feels like we use the terms to just sort of justify our own narrative. So it's the same word with a different meaning to justify our own narrative. But anyway, just go on.
No, it's great. This is what I would rather have, is a discussion. So actually, if anyone wants to comment on that, because that's exactly the point, right? We're all coming at it from our trajectory, so whatever we've accumulated up to the point, that's how we're seeing those words. And we don't often realize that others are coming from different trajectories, probably with a lot of shared regularities, but also with some that are very different. Yeah. But we assume they have the same ones as us, because somehow that's what we do in our position. We can learn not to. I think that's what meditation helps us do, or actually even just most forms of education are sort of trying to do that in a way. Or somebody mentioned dynamic minimalism, or what's digital minimalism, yeah. And that book also is kind of showing that, okay, we don't have to reject everything. Let's just look at how we use it in a different way. There's nuance, right? About how we come to this. So yeah, panpsychism actually isn't, like, we don't need to say, oh, that's wrong, and then materialism is right. Like, there's another way, actually, where we could think about what are we all saying that's in common here? And this is why I think actually talking about cognition across scales and species, having at least a sort of common definition of it would help a lot, because then we can argue much more fruitfully, instead of just saying, oh, they think that grass is like having thoughts and watching movies or something, and because nobody really thinks that. But yeah, when we really think about the bigger problems that we're trying to solve, getting into all those debates, I love them. I'm a philosopher. You have to get into all that stuff. It's really good for critical thinking, developing your mind. I wouldn't say we don't need it, but I would say when it comes to big problems, which I really feel like are urgent right now, it's kind of crazy for us to imagine it's not urgent. We have to get past that.
Since there's no general theory for many things, we have to consider
what a specific theory can add up to the
Yeah.
instead of just this construction. This specific building is wrong. I mean, it's especially because for me at least, theories are always a way to systematize several intuitions.
It's just a lens. Each of them is a different lens to look at the possibly the same.
Yeah, I think
And lots of times, not only my words, but also like the specific systematization of several ideas when they differ from the ones of other people. I have thought that we have different intuitions or paths, but in fact we have the same. So sometimes we go. It's sort of superficiality when people don't understand each other.
Yeah, I think that was part of the science talk today, right? About how I think someone was saying they were just right beside each. I don't know. Like a lot of times, this causes a lot of extra energy and time and fighting that isn't really productive. That we're all sort of saying the same thing, but we don't know it. So 20 years later, we realize it, and we're like, okay, could have actually done something a little differently. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I have just a quick question.
Okay.
Do you think that the love self is a within subject or not?
The what? I didn't hear.
Daily life and connection.
Daily life? Sorry.
I'm sorry for my pronunciation.
No, it's fine. It's not.
Daily life and connection. Bernard self.
Daily life. Convections? Does anyone know what that is?
Yeah.
Can you repeat louder?
I didn't even hear.
Bernard convections?
Wow, no
I
idea.
personally think that this
What is
Is that something I should look at?
this is the basic like most primitive cognitive subject. So just wondering you.
I don't know. I'll definitely look at
You
it.
only know Bernard from Westworld, but
There's a form of stratification where there's some boundaries being created between the two sciences, and they're completely dynamic and configuring themselves as space so as to create this boundary sustainedness. But there's just like a chemical reaction, very basic, form. Is it also catalytic?
I think
It's very interesting to see it happening.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Is it connected to something like the Markov blanket kind of idea? Or is it like how we create borders or boundaries?
yeah, well, I mean, basically there is a radiation between the high energy and low energy under the ground.
Okay.
In the earth, let's say. And then that fluid makes a cell. And this is, I think, compatible with the studied structure and stuff. And yeah, but
I'll make a note.
What
But
was
it's
the
such a
name?
good point because, sorry,
What was the sense?
Bernard convection. Bernard, I
And
don't know if I say
yeah.
it right.
Brain labor now.
Bernard convection. But that's actually something I think about a lot is because we do have cells, we do have borders, we do have membranes, we do have what you just described, but they're dynamic, they're always changing, right? So,
yeah, well, I mean, I think what I did in my PhD thesis is exactly the same as what you said.
is your PhD somewhere I can read it? Is your PhD somewhere I can read it?
Well, I can send you.
Okay, that would be great, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, I'll take a note now and look, yeah.
if you just said
What's the-
you can go.
So what's the difference between, probably something super simple, but what the difference between reaction diffusion and that?
I think it's explained through reaction diffusion.
Oh,
It's
okay.
a specific kind of, and apparently the most viral video about it is with soup.
Okay.
So it's like it can be done in various ways.
But it's the thing itself actually explained with the reaction diffusion.
So, I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, so, but thanks for bringing that up. I think there's this, like in a general way, we try to debate, is everything one, or do we really have selves and borders? And that within itself is not going to get us anywhere. It's always both, because the borders are always shifting too. And actually, I think this gets to this branchial space and all this kind of stuff I was thinking about is like, it depends where you're going to measure from what those boundaries are. From some other position, they aren't boundaries. just like if you're going to measure from a social group or a nation versus an individual or a cell, some of those boundaries aren't, like, you don't see them when you're measuring from a specific place. But at the same time, it's fluid and always changing too. So a lot of it is like realizing this multidimensionality and multispatiality, which is what I wish we could visualize, and I think a lot of people are visualizing here even, in terms of models and computations, to get out of this either or, up, down, always linear, one direction or the other space, and think about that fluid dynamics as being completely different depending which scale and position you measure it from. But sorry, you had?
That actually, I think that builds on kind of what you're saying, because you're saying that the self can change, right? The boundary of the self can change. And so I did my undergraduate at the University of Edinburgh, which is very Clarkian. It's in my tradition.
Like Andy Clark.
Yes,
okay.
I'm very curious if you're sympathetic to his extended theory of mind. If you would think that the phone is part of my mind, or what would you say about that?
So Andy Clark, extended mind. I love Andy Clark, and I think he's done a lot for lots of things, right? And I love SimBoard stuff and all that. So yeah, I'm a big fan. I wouldn't say I'm an activist or like a 4E person, because again, it's kind of, there's a whole trajectory that comes along with that, and I don't agree with all of it. But in general, yeah, of course, extended mind, of course. I just think I wouldn't say extended mind so much.
Okay.
I mean, this would get into a whole other way of thinking about technology and what our tools are. I wouldn't say the phone is like an extended mind necessarily, but it's part of our cognition, and it's part of how we make way, and it actually even becomes more important in a sense than saying it's our mind extended. But that would be a whole other discussion. But just in general, I completely agree. I think that paper that he did is great, and I think he's even said basically he was just trying to get that idea out there, and he's kind of left it behind now. It's not like something that needs to be really rigorous, and the idea just that, of course, our tools extend our cognitive capacities. Yes, I mean, obviously, yes. And that matters for things like ethics and things like what kind of technology and tools and cityscapes and sidewalks are available to you. Absolutely crucial. Those are parts of cognition and parts of health, you know.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier, you were talking about how people kind of like focus and discuss semantics rather than the actual ideas. Do you not feel like this is kind of what's happening now? Because you said you don't necessarily subscribe to the extended mind theory, but then, or you said you sympathetic to it, but then you said that you think cognition extends to the phone, but the phone is not necessarily part of your mind. And I feel like for the past like decade or so, this has been the continuous conversation in philosophy of mind about this, but it does seem like people are kind of saying the same thing in some way.
Which is why I said I totally agree.
Yeah.
It's just that if you think of cognition as waymaking, in the way that I've said, you really have to rethink all those, it's not that hard, but just rethinking our relationship to objects in a way. So a lot of that stuff just slightly shifts for me. But in general, yeah, I totally agree with Andy Clark. So I mean, that's the bigger point. Yeah. But you're right. It's exactly what happens.
What is the in way making? Is there a sort of horizon, either a visual horizon or a conceptual horizon that is? What's the sort of functionality of a horizon in way making? Because in like if you compare it to navigation, where you sort of have a prefixed spatiality, and you might have a map over that spatiality. You're always delineating your space in some way. I'm operating in this space. While way making, to me, at least in this like initial encounter with it, sounds like it's kind of making it at the same time.
It's really weird you said that, because I literally wrote something about horizon earlier in my notes, but now I can't remember what I wrote. I really wrote that word. I just don't know if I wrote it here or in my notebook. So I guess I won't try to find it now, but I really wrote that earlier today, so it's weird. So I think this gets to this idea of boundaries and membranes a bit too, and that we, in order to, and why I said dichotomy is a useful tool, and why I said, like, I wouldn't reject any actual philosophical theory, computationalism or functionalism, even identity theory had its place, because they're all measurements from a particular position, but that trajectory continues, right? But I think what you're saying is we need some way to have a scaffolding. Like, we can't, it's weird to just say there's no beginning or end, so that's why we have top down, bottom up, and all of these terms and so forth. And I think I think what I'm trying to say is, can we open the space so that we have both of those? So that I talk about this as system 3 in a way. So yeah, like we know that we're doing that, and it's a useful tool. That changes things a lot. If you just realize that we see a horizon, and or we've designated a horizon, or that's just what's possible for us right now as humans. So that seems like the end of the world. To kind of talk about that as a tool, like that's what we're doing to try to understand the encounter or the ecological, which we don't need to have a horizon there. We can't. It's kind of crazy to even think we can. So whoever said there's a beginning and end, it's more like those two are tools. But there's a way you don't reject that, right? Like you don't say there's no horizon and there's no, because depending where you are in your position, you do have limits and horizons and constraints. It gets back to Andy Clark, right? And like if you're born, or a lot of philosophy, if the trajectory that you come into, the body that you come into, is going to constrain you. And everything that everyone says to you is a kind of constraint. Those are all real. Those are all horizons. But awareness can change it, and meditation can change it, and collective action can change it. So that also gets into, do we have free will, and is there really agency? And the answer is yes and no, right? Always. Because we're constrained by one another, and we can also change one another, and we can't get out of it. So where is the horizon of waymaking? I mean, I would like to say that you don't need to have a horizon to waymaking so much as, depending on what you're going to measure and what space you're in, you can observe where those horizons are for particular agents. Yeah.
I was going to add and into that. Okay, so first of all, I really think that specific tools, the use of specific tools have, and there I include like not only terms or constructs, but also other tools, have been idealized in the sense of we have invented several tools and we define ourselves out of those tools. And what I think that most of us are, at least here, are trying to do right now is, yes, we accept that we need tools, but they are they are intrinsically temporary tools, and they don't necessarily define reality. We don't necessarily say that reality is entirely dependent on those tools. So when you take a concept, you can say, okay, yeah, I need bottom up, and top down. For example, you can say, yeah, I need certain boundaries to be able to play with my own rules and the rules that I've heard from other people and stuff. But I recognize that it's not an absolute and whatever. That was one comment. And the other comment was related to extended cognition and all that stuff, and related, in certain sense, related also to boundaries. I'm interested also in theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory and stuff. And for example, there you have this phi parameter, which is like the degree of consciousness, and then you can apply it to, since it has like an informational definition, you can a complexity definition, you can apply it to bacteria or to humans or whatever. So there you have a kind of solution to the problem, which is okay. There's this point in which consciousness is like these bold person paradigms, which is
small world paradigm. Did you say small world paradigm?
No, bold person paradigms.
Bold person. Okay.
Which is till which point? I mean, if you take hairs from a person, which is the point in which he becomes bald?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So you can imagine one way to model the quantifiability of baldness is that, like the number of hairs. But of course, you are going to get into to a certain point in which, yes, one hair is just a very big baldness, and a lot of hair a very small baldness. But the thing is that, yeah, you can get to the point in which you say, yes, since universe as a whole has a pretty low amount of hairs, it's like a big bald person. It's like baldness applied to everything. So the problem there is that we achieved quantifying a qualitative concept, but to a point in which it has no sense to the usual use of that word. So, for example, for cognition, I think it's the same. I really think that every kind of physical construct, physical system can compute in some way, and can integrate information and can increase the amount of information, blah blah blah. But the thing is that, we understand that neurons do computations, does that, but then you come to a point in which you get outside the brain, you go to peripheral neural system. It also does computations, but your gut and your kidney, everything in your body does certain amounts of computation, and you can do also the computations with the mobile phone in the sense of certain parts of your brain are not computing everything. They depend on other parts external to them that does the computation for them. So the mobile phone in that sense is also part of your brain. So the paradoxical perspective there is just, to me, that we come from a traditional perspective, and now we are trying to force it out of the box. So you can get to the point in which you say that Mars is bald, but it has a utility, and at the same time it has not a utility. So I'm not saying that I am against or in favor of. I'm just opening the
That makes me think of a lot of things, but one thing that comes is is similar argument to where does life begin and end, right? Like if you bring home some vegetables and put them in the refrigerator, somebody uses this example, at what point are they dead or whatever, or like we never can actually say there's some definitive point of baldness or even of life, or so we know there's this kind of continuum, and how do we talk about it in ways that are going to be productive? How do we model it? That's why I think modeling and computation becomes very important.
Yeah.
Because you see how it actually creates new potentials, new horizons. And at the same time, what you were saying, and the other part is important, that as we create new technology and tools, they're not separate from us. And actually, we're always extending what horizons are possible. So there's no kind of position that we're going to just get to and think, oh, now we've solved all problems of science, because the more we solve of the problems of science, the more the horizon extends. There's no. I think that's part of the mindset shift too. That's very hard, because you want to think we're going to solve this problem and then everything is solved. That's kind of what motivates you in a way, and it's hard to realize actually I'm creating more problems as I'm solving this problem. But that still means that solving this problem is worth something, because there is definitely something that's changing dynamically in a way that we, want, I guess.
And
all these terms are really.
Another way to say that is that from a pragmatic perspective inside short-term problem solving, you can say, we solved the. This is a fake quote from a physicist. I thought it was true, but it's not. But it's funny. At the beginning of the 19th century, you can imagine. We have solved nearly everything in classical physics. We just have this little problem with black bodies and with radiation, and then quantum mechanics and everything explodes and blah blah blah. So from short-term problem solving, you have this little thing that remains unsolved or unexplained, but you have a pretty complex, complete perspective. So it's nice, but then when you try to solve this little thing, a whole universe opens up, and then you realize that it's not only problem solving, it's also even if you want to only to solve a little problem, which will be quantitatively small little problem solving, it requires a huge change in the dynamics.
And that speaks to a lot of what we study in complexity science, or even what a lot of these models are showing us, that you are always shifting things at multiple scales, And depending on where you're going to measure from, it's going to either show up or not, right? And matter or not. But you don't do anything without, I mean, this is like, gets back to just Einstein and Newton and like these basic kind of laws of, you know, of change. And we know that. I guess it's just like, to try to put it in a big picture, you know, what role does all this really play in how we understand like these bigger problems, right? Like if I had to ask, if we had to say right now, what are 3 problems we'd like to solve with our work, you know, like some of them might be something really related to category theory or something. And that's actually might seem, oh, that's like a small thing, it's math or nobody's going to understand it. But actually it could have huge repercussions, as we've seen. And just if you look at what technologies come out of what I was talking about, the Macy conferences and all that weird stuff that started in the 40s and 50s that then became a lot of what inspired all the big companies that we all now carry around in our pockets and so on. You know, so these like things that seem small and nerdy or like nobody cares end up having these huge changes, but nobody connects them really anymore. Yeah, but so I don't know. What are the problems that matter to the people in this room, and how would a new definition of cognition help those problems? That's what I'm interested in. Because I think it would. I think cognition is something we're all talking about, thinking about now, whether we're creating robots or we're studying cells. So like, let's try to think a little bit about what we're talking about. That's what I would like to do. Both of you, I don't know who was first, but.
Not exactly. Yeah, okay. So what I'd like some more clarity on is how much does teleology play a role?
Teleology.
In the more cybernetic diffusion of goal-directed behavior, because especially through the framework inspired by Matt Levin, cognition is defined with the goal-directed behavior in mind. Is the goal, and a specific kind of goal, is very important for cognition to be there.
Yeah.
And there's a redefinition of what it means to reach the goal, and there's this opening up of different spaces, atomical space, space, and there's a goal that is being reached. The goal may be going from A to B in 3D space, but the goal may be reaching the developmental form of a hand in regeneration, the salamanders. So
I love it that you're asking this.
Yeah.
Because
but I'm wondering about my issue with just sticking with this kind of framing is what about exploratory forms of weighing?
Thank you very much. Yes, this is my question to Michael Levin, which we will have a talk about it, actually, he and I, because this goal-directed bothers me.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a human scale thing that we're at. And there's something weird there. I'm not criticizing him actually, because I understand why he says that, because it's understandable. But when we have a goal already, we're in this mind and thought thing, not just cognition. And a lot of what we do as humans, by the way, too, is not goal-directed that affects our life, but it is cognitive. And especially when you get to other creatures and species. So I also have a really big problem with thinking about goal direction. And it's one reason I don't use navigation, because navigation in neuroscience means you have a goal or you have wayfinding. So it's all about like the goal, and there's already like a marker that you're going to go to, and that's very linear and all of this. So I think waymaking, you can wander, you can explore. It doesn't, like, maybe half the time, a lot of the time, we don't get anywhere, you know, like get anywhere in terms of some kind of goal, but it's still meaningful, and it's still, as you were saying, like going to have perturbations on many different scales. So all that movement matters, even if there's no goal, and there's often not a goal. And I think we can talk about that in terms of evolution and the whole thing with Watson and so on. There's a lot of connections and rethinking natural selection and so on and so forth, right? Because a lot of that is this so-called top-down, bottom-up. It's one or the other, so there must be a goal. And I would like to open that up. I don't think goal-directedness is wrong at all, but I do think that you're already at a certain scale when you're imposing a goal. And it would be interesting to talk about cognition, you know, without it necessarily having a goal, because that's a lot of it, I think. Oh, sorry, I think it was you, and then.
Yeah, actually, my question was kind of similar.
Okay.
want to elaborate a little bit on that, because in a way, for me, this framework also invites the question about what's free will, and in which scale you interact with space, and I was wondering kind of the same, like how does it work in a way? Like, is there a sense of purpose in this or not? Because I understand that maybe there should
in teleology, right? Yeah.
maybe there shouldn't be. With this, with your answer right now.
I think it's very important, right? I think Michael Levin is right that we shouldn't be afraid to talk about teleology because it's part of cognition and it's part, like this is part of it, but it's not the whole thing. And it's imposed from a particular scale, which we might think of as the human scale. We can impose particular, like we can see trajectories that are real and that are teleological from our position. And that's important to talk about, but it's like what we were saying, like let's open up the space where it's not some absolute teleology. It's from a position teleological and important as such, and it shouldn't be shied away from. But you could actually, this is why I really wish we could model this in some way. If you could, move the coordinates to a completely different dimension, that teleology is going to look really different. And in fact, it might be absolutely the opposite, working against it, And this happens in, I think, social groups and humans on a smaller scale, but it's also happening in the way that different forms of life are trying to survive. And I don't mean compete, actually. I just mean make way, because a lot of it is not goal-directed again, and how we observe it and our awareness of it changes that. So all this is going on at once, right? It's not one or the other, but it's really hard to talk about it like this. It gets very, it's so much easier to put it into kind of dichotomies.
What I was thinking in a way is that through most of the talks, maybe the focus has changed in a way from individual or whatever to the interaction, right?
Yeah.
And, in that sense, like this framework, and it reminded me. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Nikolai Hartmann, which is a philosopher.
Nikolai Hartmann?
Yeah.
That sounds familiar, but yeah, I should write it down.
He wrote a lot about aesthetics and.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because he talks about this modes of relation between things and how they are. It's like regarding theory from the ancient Greeks and so
Oh,
forth.
okay.
But I thought it was interesting in a way, maybe called directness is more of what he talks about the necessary mode, which is to keep things like they are, or find to cover a necessity. There's the positive mode, which is more of this exploration and how this intrinsic relation.
Yeah, that's really good. I should look at that. It's almost like I think of teleology as inertia, from a trajectory. If you're moving in a certain way, you're going to have inertia to go, or goal-directedness too. There's an inertia, and things can change that inertia, but there is a directedness and tension in philosophy and so on, right? But that doesn't mean that it's some kind of absolute thing. And it also doesn't mean that from a different position it wouldn't look really different. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of come up this question a little bit with the idea of we don't have maybe not goal directed, but how do we because it's like a continuous, it's like independent, but we have intermittent ends in the sense not just in the end kind of analysis, so we can chop up cognition into thoughts, but also because some points, I guess, will make us reroute, right?
Yeah.
Will make us change direction. So, my mathematical is telling me that there should be some kind of formal way of distinguishing when there are opportunities, why what's kind of causally relevant in determining the next part of the trajectory, and whether there are alternatives or because it does this brilliantly accounts for cause and effect in the sense that it's cognition is alignment doesn't really stop. It just keeps going. But there are points where there are kind of causally relevant properties of current mental states that will be salient in other ways that other mental states won't be, and that will kind of they'll be deciding factors, right?
Right. I had a slide about it, but it's stuck. But yes.
Oh, great.
I love what you're. That's why I was listening to you, but I really had a slide about that, but it's stuck now. It doesn't matter. But yeah, exactly right. I think the answer to that has to do with the agent base with the position, because for a position, it's like a dead end, right? If you think, I think a lot about paths and trails and roads, and those do end. right? Or there might be a dead end, but it's never actually really a dead end. You can always keep going, or if you're, maybe you get to the edge of a cliff, but if you can swim, you can, but something really big shifts, right? And I think that is a matter of these statistical regularities shifting at, there are points, you can see it in math too, right? Where there are points where there's really big shifts of statistical regularities, and it's the same in terms of a trajectory in life in any of these spaces. Like a surprise, or we can talk about Friston and free energy and all that, which I think is also similar to this goal directedness. Already, we're talking about prediction in a way that's already at a different scale of cognition. But the point is, there is a shift. There are important, like dramatic shifts of statistical regularity that then either, like that cognition is, that trajectory of cognition is not available to that position anymore. You could call it death, I guess. But from a larger position, that trajectory is still going to have, it's not like, it doesn't just disappear. I mean, something happens, but you're going to have to look at it from a different agent base to understand that, right? So that's why I wish there was a way we could shift and look at all this. It's like when someone we love passes away, that person is still in a lot of our trajectories for a long time. But it's a different kind of space. It's not the body, space, moving, walking. But it's still in space, right? And how do you shift and measure that, and like in all the different senses, right? Not just this, okay, like, or even an ant that's crawling and suddenly we step on it. The trajectory ends there, but I just saw a dragonfly get eaten by a grasshopper. It was like the most violent, crazy thing. The dragonfly was like gone in a minute, and this grasshopper was just like so intent, like my dog when I feed it, it was just like crazy, And I mean, that was the end of a trajectory, but not really. I mean, because it became part of the grasshopper. So there's all these ways we can like shift and look at what a trajectory is. But you're right, there are definitely breaks from a position that are really hard. And
I guess it's like it's a kind of new version of like a classical mind-body problem, which is like what parts of mind, like what parts of the body are mind. Like how do you distinguish between the kind of influence of the physical contributions of physical systems play in cognition, and the ones that could clearly play the biggest role in cognition?
But I think that assumes mind and body are different. And
Yeah.
I mean, I would say they're both, well, whatever the trajectory, like all that we just said is mind and body. I mean, but if it depends how you want to judge it, right? That's actually a good example, like of what I was saying about the memories of people living on. Because if you're from a position of that kind of measurement, if we're thinking about emotions or feelings or something, then it's different, the trajectory. Yeah. So I think it's probably time for like food and music and like all this stuff. But thank you.
Kind of like a small question. Well, congrats. This is all really, really fantastic.
Yeah, thanks.